Collaboration in the devastating wars of Imam Gran against the central authorities describes the intensity of the rivalry. Beckingham and Huntingford 1961. They also had an uneasy relationship with the Tigray Shams, chiefs, of Hantalo and Gujarat. Beckingham and Huntingford 1961, CASA 2001. The foundational geoclimatic and socio-political barriers described in the first section influenced the competition expressed mainly in terms of control over key natural resources and trade routes. Unlike other sultanates, e.g. Afat, the Afar remained insulated from the Abyssinian Empire by the considerable distance between them and stayed relatively autonomous. Trimingham 1952, Pankhurst 1997. Traditionally, the Afar, also known as Dankal, were organized into sultanates and ruled by independent sultans. Therefore, the claim that other Afar sultanates were feudatory or subordinate to the Sultan of Azza are far-fetched. However, although autonomous, they have shown cooperation and rivalry with each other as they did with neighboring communities, and cross-sultanate interactions were common. Nonetheless, it must be stressed that in all the countries the traditional authority of the sultans has diminished, and their involvement has become more symbolic and limited to traditional conflict resolution according to customary laws. Some of the sultanates have ceased to exist. Currently, in all three countries where the Afar are found, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Djibouti, elected or appointed provincial or local state leaders wield more power. 4.3. No evidence that Abyssinia historically controlled Assab. There is no evidence that Abyssinia historically controlled the Assab area or any of the areas under the Afar. Trimingham 1952, Markakis 2021, Ashami 2018. There were indeed claims and counterclaims, including military expeditions by famous Abyssinian leaders that reached coastal areas. Contrary to the claims, the Afar remained autonomous for centuries, and part of the Afar land was under the Ethiopian flag only during the expansion of the Ethiopian Empire under Emperor Menelik II. Then, Eritrea and Djibouti were firmly established as Italian and French colonies, respectively. Assab itself did not come into the picture until its purchase, as was noted in Chapter 1, by the Italian Ribattino Company in 1869. Until then nearby Bailul was the local port used primarily by the Afar. As mentioned earlier, Massawa in the north, Zila and Berbera and to some extent, Tadjara, Djibouti, were the main outlets connecting the hinterland. Remarkably, some of the dubious claims over Assab include legal loopholes in the agreements between Afar sultans and Ribattino. First, the basis of the claim is shaky as the agreements have nothing to do with Ethiopia in the first place. As indicated above, the country had no official control over the area. There were no countries known as Eritrea or Ethiopia in their present geopolitical positions and borders. Second, the agreements were made redundant by the border agreements between Italy and Emperor Menelik II defining the current political geography of Eritrea and Ethiopia. Those are the same agreements used in the UN Resolution, 1950, to federate Eritrea with Ethiopia, adopted by the Eritrean Federal Constitution ratified by Emperor Haile Selassie, 1952, upheld by the Eritrean referendum of 1993, and the basis for the Algiers Agreement, 2000. 4.4. The argument that the Afar must stay in one country. One of the key arguments used by Ethiopian elites in their attempt to legitimize the Red Sea ownership claim is that the Afar people are one and must stay in one country under one flag, and that country must be Ethiopia. A related claim is that since most ethnic Afar are found in Ethiopia, which makes Ethiopia the home of the Afar, and thus, the Afar of Eritrea and Djibouti and their land and coastal areas should be part of Ethiopia. These claims represent a flagrant violation of Eritrean and Djiboutian sovereignty and territorial integrity. In spirit and content, the proposition is not dissimilar to the Bevins-Forza plan concocted by Great Britain and the USA in the 1940s, aiming at ceding the highlands and eastern parts of Eritrea to Ethiopia and the western lowlands to Sudan, which all Eritreans, Unionists, and independentists soundly rejected. United Nations 1996. Some historians have suggested that Ethiopia's claim over Eritrea was not focused on sea access only but was a genuine attempt at Ethiopia and Eritrea, e.g. Reta 2000, Sishane 2007. In contradiction to the claims, Ethiopia had accepted the dismemberment of Eritrea after initial reluctance, Haile 1988, Tesfaye 2002. Ethiopia shares ethnic groups with other countries, as is true with many other African countries. Ethnic-based border claims and counterclaims, contradicting colonially established agreements could lead to devastating wars, for example, the Ethiopia-Somali Wars of 1964 and 1977-78. The claims that the Sultan of Azza was and is the sole leader of the Afar people and that his claim of the Red Sea being Ethiopian underestimates the role of Eritrean Afar and their leaders in the Eritrean anti-colonial struggle and the struggle for independence. The Afar, like the other nationalities in Eritrea, played a prominent role in the political struggle of the 1940s and 1950s and in the armed struggle that followed. Their knowledge of seafaring, especially night navigation, and extensive network in the Middle East was critical. The landmark vote in the unobserved and verified Eritrean referendum of 1993 by the people of the then Dankalaya province, which at the time was predominantly Afar, was not different from the rest of the country, 99.65% versus 99.82%, respectively, and was a clear testament of allegiance. Equally, when the Eritrean case was presented to the UN in the 1950s, most Eritrean Afar elites at the time were members of the Muslim League of Eritrea, the New Eritrea Pro-Italia Party and the Italo-Eritrean Association, which all were for independence, either immediately or following a period of custody under the UN or Italy. Records of the UN Commission that visited Eritrea in 1950 and held more than 70 public and private meetings in the country to ascertain the wishes of the people show that the Eritrean Afar overwhelmingly supported independence. 5.0. Sea access and the demographic pressure. A common tendency of the sea access/ownership claim school is a narrow focus on the Malthusian trap and neglecting the role of structural and socio-political factors that are more fundamental to development. The population burden is only one of many symptoms. If previous authors used the issue of sea access as a tool of methodological nationalism, Prime Minister Ethiopia'S remarks, "Where there are hungry people, the laws will not work," is extreme. His assertion about the enormity of the population burden and the lack of capacity of neighboring countries to assist Ethiopia in absorbing the pressure may be correct, but the fact that the issue is a shared domain of all developing countries, especially in Africa, suggests that the answers lie outside sea access. In the Horn of Africa, all states, large and small, coastal and landlocked, are not only isolated from each other but also marginalization is a common internal feature. Thus, an outlook on the issue of sea access in the context of extractive economic policies that have led to a long history of extreme poverty, internal and regional conflicts and harmful foreign interventions deeply ingrained in the national and regional politics could be beneficial. So far, the claims put forward by Ethiopian elites do not consider the specific characteristics of Ethiopia and the Hoa. They tend to invite conflict with maritime countries, especially Eritrea, because they are mainly driven by the perception of handicap reinforced by the historical obsession. It is an expansionist view passed from imperialists to nationalists, ethnic and Ethiopianist. The most fundamental question is whether it is possible to overcome the geoclimatic barrier, and the socio-political distance built up over the centuries. Spatial diversification of the economy as suggested by the growth of regional capitals in Ethiopia may provide some clue, but expanding the economy to historically marginalized areas remains a critical challenge. We agree with Prime Minister Abiy about the inability of other Hoa countries to support Ethiopia in absorbing the increasing population pressure. Where we differ is the reason used to explain the problem resulting from an imbalance in the economy of the Hoa and has little to do with sea access. Specifically, coastal areas are less developed to help absorb the increasing human pressure. 6. Summary and conclusion. In this chapter analyzed the two interlinked issues of geography and demography that are part of Ethiopia's main arguments to support its demand for ownership of and access to the sea. we explored the role of physical geography and key periods in history defining the evolution of socio-economic isolation between and within countries in the Horn of Africa. Countries in the Horn of Africa are not only socio-politically isolated from each other but also marked isolation exists within a country, particularly in Ethiopia. The physico-climatic isolation is exacerbated by three interrelated historical developments. A. The social distance triggered by the expansion of Islam to the lowlands and coastal areas of the region, forcing the Central Abyssinian Empire south and westwards. B. The occupation of coastal areas by Europeans in the 19th century, and C. Misguided development policies followed during the post-colonial period, including recent interaction with globalization. Ethiopian elites' geographic and demographic arguments oversimplify the social and economic problems at hand. Without institutional restructuring, the significant spatial difference will not be overcome, even with free access to sea. The current Ethiopian expansionist rhetoric, sometimes advocating forceful ownership of a sea outlet, will compound mistrust among states and reinforce the existing isolation. Regarding the ethnic argument centered on the ethnic Afar, we have shown that in the struggle for Eritrea's self-determination and independence, commencing in the 1940s, and throughout the armed struggle phase, its Afar population played a critical role. The argument by Ethiopians that the majority of ethnic Afar reside in Ethiopia, and therefore, the Afar lands straddling Eritrea and Djibouti should belong to Ethiopia violates the territorial integrity of the independent states of Eritrea and Djibouti and goes contrary to the African Union, policy and international norms, as described in Chapter 3. References Al-Shami, M.G. 1985. The Political Economy of the Afar Region of Ethiopia, a Dynamic Periphery. Cambridge, reprint published by Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, Halle, Sala. Begashaw, 2010. Guaranese. Port of Assab as a factor for economic development and regional conflict. Paper presented at the Conference on Good Governance, Peace, Security, Sustainable Development in Ethiopia and Horn of Africa, convened by the Advocacy for Ethiopia, AFE, and Ethiopian National Priorities Consultative Process, Inc., in Washington, D.C., April 9 to 11, 2010. Shami, H. 2018. Al-Manhal, The Source in the History and Narratives of the Afar, Danakil. Cairo. 700 P. Haile, S. 1988. Historical Background to the Ethiopian-Eritrean Conflict. In Davidson, B., and Cliff, L., eds. The Long Struggle of Eritrea for Independence and Constructive Peace. Red Sea Press. Haile Mariam, Y. 2011. Asab Yemen Nat. Addis Ababa. Amharic, Kasai, AT 2007. Ethiopia's Sovereign Right of Access to the Sea under International Law. Ma Thesis. University of Georgia. Markakis, J. 2021a. The Afar. The Crisis of the State in the Horn of Africa. In Markakis, J. Schley, G. and Young, J. The Nation State, A Wrong Model for the Horn of Africa. Max Planck Research Library for the History and Development of Knowledge Studies. Number 14. Markakis, J. 2021b. The Crisis of the State in the Horn of Africa. In Markakis, J. Schley, G. and Young, J. The Nation State, A Wrong Model for the Horn of Africa. Max Planck Research Library for the History and Development of Knowledge Studies. Number 14. Pankhurst, RKP. 1997. The Ethiopian Borderlands, Essays in Regional History from Ancient Times to the End of the 18th Century. The Red Sea Press. Lawrenceville, New Jersey. 489 P. Retta, Z. 2000. Eritrea. Birhana Selam Printing Press. Addis Ababa. Amharic, Mahdi, S. 2016. Security and Foreign Policy of Landlocked States. Ph.D. Thesis. University of Massachusetts Sishane, S. 2007. Unionists and separatists, the vagaries of Ethio-Eritrean relation 1941-1991. Sahai Publishers and Distributors. 216 pages Tesfaye, A 2002. Ainfalil, 1941-1950. Asmara, Hujri Publishers. Trimingham, J.S. 1952 Islam in Ethiopia. London, New York, Oxford University Press. Integrinia, Yuhan, B.B. 2013 Djibouti, Yetiganatachan Mesfaria. Addis Ababa. 124 pages, in Amharic. Chapter 3 International Law on Access to the Sea, Eritrea and Ethiopia. Gibra H. Tesfaye Orgis, Paulos Tesfaye Orgis and Timi Tulad Birhan. Introduction. Ethiopia's Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, in addressing his legislative body and the nation, asserted the Red Sea as the natural border of Ethiopia, and described ownership of access to the sea as an existential issue. He based his assertion on historical, cultural, geographic, and demographic factors. This chapter aims to address the issue of access to the sea from the perspective of international law. Specifically, 3 international laws, pertinent to the issue in varying degrees, are addressed in this chapter. 1. The African Ethiopia'S Poseidotus that established the inviolability of colonially established boundaries. 2. Article 2, 4, of the United Nations Charter that prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, and 3. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, for short, now considered the customary international law governing issues related to the sea. 1.0 Territorial definition of Eritrea. Before delving into the legal issues outlined above, it is essential to establish the territorial definition of Eritrea. Eritrea has been an internationally recognized sovereign state for over 30 years. Its internationally recognized territory has been defined by the colonial treaties between colonial Italy and Ethiopia of 1900, 1902, and 1908, including the Red Sea coast and its ports. It is the exact definition that the UN took up for disposal, as one of 3 former Italian colonies, following Italy's defeat in World War II. When Eritrea was federated with Ethiopia, based on the UN Resolution 390, v. the Constitution of Eritrea, drafted at the time, and ratified by the then Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, in its Article 2, defines Eritrea as, the territory of Eritrea, including the islands, is that of the former Italian colony of Eritrea. The costly war of independence and political struggles for self-determination conducted for over 5 decades were for the same Eritrea. When the internationally observed referendum of 1993 was conducted, resulting in formal independence supported by a vote of 99.8%, it was with the exact territorial definition in mind. When subsequently, recognition was extended to Eritrea as an independent, sovereign state by the international community, including Ethiopia itself, it was for the exact territorial definition. Finally, when the Eritrea-Ethiopia Border Commission, EEBC, took up the border case between Eritrea and Ethiopia, following the border war between the 2 countries, it used the colonially defined territory of Eritrea as the basis for adjudicating the border conflict in 2001. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed himself agreed with and accepted the Commission's decision in 2018 when he initiated the rapprochement with Eritrea. 2.0. Violations of international law. The territorial definition of Eritrea described in the preceding section is consistent with what has come to be known as the African Ethiopia'S Poseidotus. It refers to the principle adopted in 1964, Eritrea's War of Independence started in 1961, by the then Organization of African Unity, OAU, which declared sovereignty and inviolability of colonially inherited boundaries regardless of pre-colonial territorial configurations. The Assembly of Heads of State and Government of OAU in its ordinary session in Cairo, on July 17 to 26, 1964, declared that all member states pledge to respect the borders existing on their achievement of national independence. the principle of African Ethiopia'S has acquired the status of international law. So, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed openly claims Ethiopia's right to the Red Sea in addressing his legislative body and the nation, based on cultural, historical, geographic, and demographic factors, he is breaching the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Eritrea, and thus, violating international law by going contrary to the principle of the African Ethiopia'S. In his statement, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed quotes historical figures who claimed the Red Sea as the natural border of Ethiopia and described the current lack of access an existential threat to the country. He added that if acquiring access through peaceful means is not possible, resorting to force will be necessary. Such a veiled threat to a neighboring sovereign state, thrown around in a cavalier and irresponsible manner by a head of state, violates the United Nations Charter. Article 4 of the Union Charter prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Following the Prime Minister's address, and subsequent posturing through a military parade, several Ethiopian scholars and media outlets continue to echo his false narrative about ownership of access to the Red Sea. This false narrative has created a dangerous atmosphere threatening the peace and security of not only Eritrea and Ethiopia but the whole region of the Horn of Africa. Ethiopian elites often refer to the UN Federal Resolution 390, which mentions Ethiopia's legitimate need for adequate access to the sea, as one of the important factors the World Organization considered. They assert this fact gives Ethiopia a legal right of ownership of Eritrea itself or a coastal area thereof. They also fault the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, Ethiopia'S, especially the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, for granting Eritrea its independence without demanding at least a SAB. The problem with the first claim is that it confuses ownership with right of access. Yes, the UN recognized Ethiopia's right of access to the sea. As detailed below, international law also provides that right. None of the coastal states in the region, including Eritrea, denies Ethiopia's right of access to the sea, but not the right to own any part of their territories. Regarding the second assertion, Ethiopia'S did not grant Eritrea its independence. Eritreans earned their country's independence through their sweat and blood over a long period of a costly armed struggle. Ethiopia'S was presented with a de facto independence, and the best it could do at the time was agree with the newly independent country to have access to the Red Sea through the Eritrean ports, mainly of Assab. It must be emphasized that Ethiopia's claim of ownership of any part of Eritrea, including its Red Sea coast and ports, is an affront to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Eritrea. It is also tantamount to declaration of war, as Ethiopia has no right, whatsoever, to any Eritrean territory. Claims based on historical, cultural, geographic, and demographic factors, in the manner and timing Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed did, violate international law as represented in the African Ethiopia'S, and Article 4 of the Union Charter. The right Ethiopia legitimately has, and is entitled to claim, as detailed below, is the right of access to the sea and freedom of transit. Landlocked Ethiopia's right of access to the sea is recognized by all its neighboring transit states, including Eritrea. 3.0. Right of access to the sea and freedom of transition globally. There are 44 landlocked states, 16 of them, including Ethiopia, located in Africa. The right of access to the sea and freedom of transition is a legitimate issue for landlocked countries. A brief history of the concept and how it developed into an internationally recognized principle and right will be helpful. 3.1. History of right of access to the sea. The history of the issue of access to the sea is marked by, on the one hand, landlocked states desiring and pushing for unrestricted right of free access, and on the other, transit states pushing back, claiming the supremacy of territorial sovereignty. Historically, several conventions were held to reconcile the two competing principles. The following are the significant ones. In 1804, the Convention of Vienna adopted the principle of the freedom of navigation on the Rhine, an important international river in Europe. That convention laid the foundation for the Vienna Congress of 1814 that established the freedom of navigation without discrimination in international rivers and their tributaries. The Barcelona Convention of April 20, 1921, established the principle of freedom of transit by requiring all contracting states to facilitate freedom of transit by rail or international navigable waterway. However, it added, provided the security and vital interests of the transit country are not adversely affected. The New York Convention of 1965, which came into force in 1967, adopted a resolution advocating the necessity of recognizing the right of free transit to the sea for landlocked states. However, it added that such a right is permitted under mutually acceptable means. The New York Convention is significant on two counts. 1. It was the first international agreement that dealt exclusively with the specific issue of transit trade, and 2, and more importantly, it recognized the access issue as